A millionaire assumes the identity of a taxi driver to investigate his own company. He is astounded to discover dark secrets and the reality of his employees. Martin Walker, a man whose name resonated across boardrooms and stock markets alike, sat in silence. The world outside his glass-walled office buzzed with the energy of a thriving tech empire, the very empire he had built from nothing. Every success, every deal, every triumph bore his signature. Yet, despite the polished surface, a gnawing feeling of unease had taken root. Whispers of corruption and employee mistreatment within his own company had reached his ears. The company he'd built on principles of transparency and ethics was now under suspicion, and the thought was intolerable. For days, Martin wrestled with the implications. How could something like this be happening under his nose? He prided himself on being involved, on knowing every facet of his business. But the rumors persisted. The most troubling part was not knowing the truth. Whether his company had truly lost its moral compass, or if these were just exaggerated complaints from disgruntled employees. He knew the only way to uncover the reality was to see it with his own eyes, from the ground up. And so, the decision was made. He would go undercover. He would become someone else entirely. The plan felt absurd at first. A billionaire CEO, accustomed to luxury and power, taking on the role of a lowly taxi driver. But there was no better way to infiltrate the lower tiers of his business, where, he suspected, the real issues were festering. His company had acquired a taxi service during one of its expansions, and it seemed the perfect entry point. No one would suspect that Mike Thompson, a middle-aged man with a worn face and callous hands, was actually Martin Walker. He'd disappear into the background, invisible among the working class. The transformation was drastic. Martin traded his tailored suits for cheap jeans, a worn leather jacket, and a baseball cap that hid his well-groomed hair. His face, usually clean-shaven, now sported a rough stubble, and his posture, once proud and commanding, became slouched, unassuming. Even his voice changed. It was rougher, more tired, matching the persona of a man scraping by. Mike Thompson was born when Martin, now Mike, first walked into the taxi garage. The stark contrast to his life of luxury hit him immediately. The place was run down, a far cry from the sleek offices he was used to. The walls were grimy, stained with years of neglect, and the smell of engine oil and sweat permeated the air. The garage was loud, not with conversation, but with the clattering of tools and the occasional curse from a frustrated mechanic. The drivers barely acknowledged each other, too absorbed in their own weariness to offer anything more than a grunt or nod. Mike didn't expect a warm welcome, but the atmosphere was worse than he imagined. It felt oppressive, as if the weight of exhaustion and disillusionment hung over everyone there. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the broken equipment, the flickering lights, and the defeated expressions on the faces of the workers. This was his company. This was what he had allowed to happen under his watch. Then, from the far end of the garage, a voice barked, "You the new guy?" Martin turned to see a man approaching. John, the garage manager, was exactly the type of person Martin had feared he'd find running things down here. The man was built like a bulldog, short but stocky, with a perpetual scowl on his face. His skin was weathered, and his hair was greasy, slicked back in an attempt to look presentable, but it only made him look more unapproachable. He wore a dirty jacket that barely concealed a belly stretching the seams of his shirt. "Yeah," Martin replied, forcing his voice to sound less confident than it normally did. "Mike Thompson." John didn't bother with pleasantries. "Thompson, huh? Doesn't matter. You're not gonna last here long, Thompson." He smirked, eyes glinting with a mixture of disdain and dark amusement. "None of you newbies do. Without waiting for a response, John tossed a set of keys at him. They clinked loudly as Martin caught them, the weight of the old, rusted keys more symbolic than he realized in that moment. Take number 23. She's a piece of crap, but so are most of them. Try not to crash it. John sneered, before turning away as if Martin was already forgotten. Martin stared at the keys in his hand for a moment, the cold metal biting into his palm. This was it. His first step into a world he'd never truly seen. A world that, until now, had only existed in spreadsheets and quarterly reports. His heart pounded as he walked through the rows of decrepit taxis, searching for number 23. When he found it, he understood why John had called it a piece of crap. The car was old, with dents along its sides and a windshield that was slightly cracked. It was nothing like the sleek, high-end cars he was used to driving. As he sat inside, the musty smell of stale cigarettes and sweat hit him. The seat cushions were worn thin, and the dashboard was littered with buttons that barely functioned. Martin took a deep breath, his mind momentarily flashing back to the comfort of his office. But this was what he needed. He couldn't solve the problems of his company from a distance. He needed to immerse himself, become one of the many invisible workers keeping his empire afloat. He watched as the other drivers moved around him, most keeping their heads down, moving quickly to get their shift started. There was a palpable tension in the air, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next thing to go wrong. No one seemed to speak unless it was absolutely necessary, and even then, it was in curt, tired tones. It wasn't long before John reappeared, standing at the entrance of the garage with a cigarette hanging from his lips. "You still here, Thompson?" he called out, voice thick with sarcasm. "Thought you'd have run off by now." Martin gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to respond as he normally would, with authority. Instead, he simply nodded and forced a weak smile, trying to blend into the background. "Just getting started," he muttered. John snorted, blowing smoke in his direction before disappearing back into his office, leaving Martin to the task at hand. He sat there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of what he was about to undertake. This mission, his undercover work, was more dangerous than he initially thought. It wasn't just about uncovering corruption. It was about surviving in a world where no one cared, where everyone was out for themselves. As he turned the ignition and the engine sputtered to life with a weak growl, Martin took one last look around the garage. The drivers were already scattering, heading out into the streets, blending into the city traffic. They were invisible, unnoticed, and unappreciated. He was about to become one of them. With a deep breath, Martin, now Mike, pulled out of the garage, his mind racing with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The road to the truth was long, and he had only just begun. Over the next few weeks, Martin, still living as Mike Thompson, began to settle into the grueling routine of a taxi driver. Each day blurred into the next, marked by the constant hum of the engine, the endless stream of passengers, and the mounting pressure to meet impossible quotas. There was little time for breaks, let alone conversation. The drivers moved like ghosts, working long shifts, keeping their heads down, and saying as little as possible. The job wasn't just hard, it was suffocating. Martin quickly noticed the oppressive rhythm of the work. Drivers were expected to be on the road for hours without stopping. When they did manage to catch a moment's rest, it wasn't in comfort. It was in the cab of their worn-out taxis, parked on the side of a busy street or in a dingy corner of the garage. The few conversations Martin overheard from his fellow drivers were short and bitter, filled with frustration and exhaustion. It was clear that morale was dangerously low, but no one seemed willing to speak up. The pressure was relentless. Every day, John, the garage manager, barked orders push quotas, and enforce rules that seemed deliberately designed to make life harder for the drivers. His presence was a constant reminder of the power imbalance. His words were laced with contempt, and his management style was one of intimidation. Drivers who made even the smallest mistake were hit with heavy fines, and the fear of being in debt to John kept everyone on edge. Martin observed it all, playing the role of the quiet newcomer, biding his time as he pieced together the full scope of what was happening in the company. He kept his interactions minimal, his conversations guarded, but he listened, and the more he listened, the more he realized how deep the problem ran. The company's foundation, which he had once believed was built on fairness and transparency, now seemed rotten to its core. Something had gone terribly wrong, and John was just the tip of the iceberg. One afternoon, after an especially draining shift, Martin found himself in a small, run-down diner near the garage. He had parked the taxi outside and stepped inside, the door jangling as he entered. The smell of cheap coffee and greasy food filled the air. The place was nearly empty except for a couple of other drivers who sat hunched over at tables, staring into their cups like they were trying to drown out the exhaustion of the day. It was in this moment that Martin met Carla. She was sitting alone at the counter, sipping a cup of coffee that looked as tired as she did. Her face was etched with lines of worry, and her shoulders slumped with the weight of what he imagined were years of struggle. But despite her exhaustion, there was something about her, a resilience, a spark that set her apart from the other drivers. She noticed Martin lingering near the counter and gave a nod of acknowledgement. "Mike, right?" she asked, her voice low but clear. Martin had seen her around but hadn't spoken to her much. He nodded, taking the seat next to her. "Yeah," he said, keeping his tone casual. "Thompson, you're Carla, right?" "That's me," she replied with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've been here a few weeks now, getting used to it." Martin shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "I guess. It's tough, though. A lot tougher than I expected." Carla snorted softly, stirring her coffee with a spoon. "You don't know the half of it." She glanced around the diner, making sure no one else was close enough to overhear, then leaned in slightly. "Working here, it's not just about driving. It's about surviving." Martin's curiosity piqued at her words. He had been waiting for an opening like this, a chance to dig deeper into what was really going on. He played dumb, frowning slightly as if he didn't fully understand. "Surviving," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Carla sighed, setting her spoon down and rubbing her temples like the weight of the explanation alone was too much. "John, he treats us like garbage. The fines, the constant pressure, the impossible quotas, it's all designed to break us. And if you make even one mistake, he punishes you for it. But it's worse than that." She looked up, her eyes hardening with anger. "He's stealing from us." Martin felt a flicker of anticipation. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone inside made it real. "Stealing how?" he asked carefully, making sure not to sound too eager. Carla leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "You've seen the fines, right? You get a scratch on the car, it's a fine. You're late for your shift, it's another fine. Half the time, the fines don't even make sense. And then John takes a cut. He schemes off the top, but it doesn't stop there. He's got connections higher up, people who look the other way because they're getting something out of it, too." Martin absorbed her words in silence, his mind racing. John wasn't just abusing his power as the garage manager. He was part of a larger scheme, something that reached beyond the garage and into the higher levels of the company. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just a case of one corrupt man. It was systemic. And if John had protection from above, It would be much harder to dismantle the corruption than Martin had originally thought. "You ever think about reporting it?" Martin asked, trying to sound nonchalant. He didn't want to spook her, but he needed to know if anyone had tried to blow the whistle. Carla let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Report it to who? You think anyone up there cares about us? We're just numbers to them. John's got them all in his pocket. If you complain, you're out of a job. Simple as that. And people are scared. They've got families to feed, bills to pay. No one's going to risk that to take on John." Her words carried a heavy truth. The system was designed to keep people silent. Fear, manipulation, and desperation. It was the perfect combination to keep everyone in line. Martin understood that all too well now. If he were to make a move, he would need more than just whispers and rumors. He would need hard evidence, something undeniable. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence. Martin sipped his coffee, feeling the weight of what he had learned settle in his chest. He glanced over at Carla, who was staring into her cup, her fingers tapping nervously against the ceramic. "Why are you telling me this?" Martin asked finally, his voice quiet. Carla looked up, meeting his eyes. There was something raw in her expression, a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "Because I'm tired, Mike. I'm tired of watching good people get crushed under John's boot. I don't know what you can do about it, but maybe you're different. Maybe you're not like the rest of them." Martin didn't respond right away. He couldn't. How could he explain to her that he wasn't just another driver, that he wasn't Mike Thompson at all, but the very man who owned the company she was so disillusioned with? The irony wasn't lost on him. The weight of his responsibility felt heavier than ever. "I don't know if I'm different," he said carefully, "but I do know this can't keep going. Something has to change." Carla studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Finally, she nodded, a small gesture, but it carried the weight of someone who had given up hope too many times before. "Yeah," she said softly, "but it's been this way for a long time, Mike. Don't get your hopes up. No one's ever been able to stop him." The conversation lingered in Martin's mind long after Carla left the diner. As he drove through the city streets that night, the flashing lights of the urban landscape passing by, he knew that things were worse than he had imagined. John was more than just a bad manager. He was the symptom of a much larger sickness within the company. And if Martin didn't act soon, everything he had built could be lost to the corruption that had taken root beneath the surface. But now, he had a plan forming in his mind, a dangerous, complex plan that would require careful execution. And if he was going to take John down, he would need more than Carla's testimony. He would need undeniable proof, something that could topple not just John, but the entire corrupt structure propping him up. With the first seeds of doubt planted, Martin drove on into the night, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. The conversation with Carla had sparked something within Martin, something he hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just that her words had confirmed his suspicions, but the depth of the problem felt more vast than he had originally feared. Over the following weeks, Martin, under the guise of Mike Thompson, became even more observant. He kept his head down, just as he had been doing, but his eyes were sharper now, tuned into the subtle cracks in the system, the cracks that Carla had warned him about, and that John was so determined to exploit. Martin noticed patterns he hadn't fully registered before. Drivers were constantly hit with fines for the smallest infractions, taking a break for more than a few minutes, being late by a single minute, or even scratches on their cars that were there long before they started their shifts. The fines, often arbitrary and harsh, seemed almost like a tool of control, meant to keep the drivers indebted and submissive. John had created an environment where fear ruled. Drivers lived in constant dread of making a mistake, knowing it could cost them more than just money. It could cost them their jobs, their livelihoods, their family security. And John, always looming in the background, was more than just an enforcer. His smug face, the way he barked orders and collected fines, hinted at something far more sinister. The more Martin observed, the more he realized that John wasn't acting alone. The level of corruption felt too organized, too protected. There were people higher up who were either turning a blind eye or actively supporting it. It became clearer with each passing day that the rot went far beyond the garage. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Martin found himself alone in the garage. Most of the other drivers had already left, and the dull hum of the few remaining engines was fading. John was there, leaning over a makeshift desk in the corner, scribbling something on a stack of papers. He hadn't noticed Martin yet. Martin approached quietly, not intending to be stealthy, but not wanting to attract unnecessary attention either. He couldn't help but glance at the papers John was working on. From his angle, the writing was hard to make out, but then something caught his eye, a list of names. Driver names, alongside figures that didn't seem to match the numbers Martin had seen in the official records. His heart pounded as the realization hit him. John was falsifying the records. The fines drivers were being forced to pay were inflated, far more than what the official reports showed. He wasn't just punishing drivers. He was stealing from them. Martin's mind raced. This was it. Proof. John wasn't just skimming off the top. He was systematically bleeding the drivers dry, and no one in the company seemed to care, or worse, someone was helping him. He needed to dig deeper, to find out just how far this corruption went. But before he could study the papers further, John's voice cut through the silence. Interested in something, rookie? Martin's muscles tensed. He turned slowly, forcing a casual expression onto his face. But his heart was still racing. John was watching him. His eyes narrowed, suspicion thick in his voice. He was leaning back now, arms crossed, a mocking smirk playing on his lips. "Just waiting for my next shift," Martin replied, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. Didn't mean to interrupt. John's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than Martin liked. There was a flicker of something in them, maybe a hint of recognition, or perhaps just paranoia. Either way, Martin knew he had to tread carefully. "Better be," John muttered, turning back to his papers. "You're not paid to stand around and stare." Martin nodded, taking that as his cue to leave. He walked away slowly, fighting the urge to look back. His mind was already spinning with plans. He needed to act fast. The evidence was right there in front of him. But he couldn't afford to confront John without something more concrete, something undeniable. As he reached the exit of the garage, he could feel John's eyes on his back, still watching, still suspicious. The tension hung in the air, and Martin knew that any misstep from this point on could blow his cover. He needed to play this smart. Over the next few days, Martin kept a low profile, but his focus never wavered. He began to gather more evidence, paying closer attention to the numbers, to the records, to the other drivers' stories. He listened to them during the brief moments when they allowed themselves to vent, their frustrations bubbling to the surface in short, clipped sentences. It wasn't just the fines. There were also strange deductions from their paychecks that no one could explain. And yet, no one dared to confront John. The fear was palpable. "Sometimes I feel like I'm paying more to work here than what I'm actually earning," one driver muttered bitterly to Martin during a rare break. "And if you say something, you're gone. It's that simple." Martin nodded, offering little more than a sympathetic grunt. But inside, his anger was growing. Every story was another piece of the puzzle, another layer to the corruption that was strangling the company from the inside. And still, John remained untouchable. One afternoon, Martin found himself in another conversation with Carla, this time in the garage during a lull between shifts. She was wiping the sweat from her brow, looking more worn than usual, and Martin could tell the weight of everything was bearing down on her. "Any more fines?" Martin asked casually, though he already knew the answer. Carla laughed, a harsh sound devoid of any humor. "Of course. This time for a late pickup. I was literally 5 minutes behind schedule." 5 minutes, Mike. That's all it takes for John to hit you with $100 fine. And that's on top of the other deductions. I can barely keep up anymore." Martin could hear the frustration in her voice, but beneath it, there was something else: resignation. She, like so many others, had accepted that this was just the way things were. "How long do you think it's been like this?" he asked, keeping his tone casual, but his mind was already analyzing the timeline. Carla shrugged, staring into the distance. "Longer than I've been here, that's for sure. John's been running this place for years, and no one's ever done a damn thing about it. They all just turn a blind eye, let him do whatever he wants. I don't know who he's paying off, but whoever it is, they're making sure he stays right where he is." Martin's stomach turned at the thought. This wasn't just about John's greed. It was about a system that allowed him to thrive. Whoever was protecting him wasn't just complicit. They were enabling him. Carla turned to face Martin, her expression dark. "You think anyone cares about us? We're just numbers to them. We keep the wheels turning, but they'd replace us in a heartbeat. John knows that. He knows we're all too scared to push back." Martin said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Carla had no idea just how deeply he understood what she was saying, no idea who she was really speaking to. As the weeks dragged on, Martin gathered more and more evidence. He stayed vigilant, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to act. But with each passing day, the weight of the truth became harder to bear. It wasn't just John. The corruption went much deeper. And if Martin was going to expose it, he would have to bring down more than just one man. He would have to dismantle an entire system. The tension between him and John grew as well. John's suspicion lingered, and Martin could feel the man watching him more closely now, like a predator waiting for a sign of weakness. Martin knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, one slip, and everything he had worked for could come crashing down. But he couldn't wait forever. Something had to give, and soon. Then one night it happened. Martin was finishing up a late shift when he saw John again, standing by his usual spot near the desk. This time, though, something felt different. John wasn't just going through his usual routine. He was looking through some documents, a smug smile creeping across his face as he spoke to someone on the phone. Martin couldn't hear everything, but one word stood out: transfer. His heart raced. This was it. Whatever John was involved in, it was happening now. The transfer, the money, the system. It was all connected. He had to act. The time for waiting was over. And Martin, no longer just Mike Thompson, the quiet driver, was ready. In the days that followed Martin's discovery, the atmosphere between him and John grew increasingly tense. Every time Martin crossed paths with John in the garage, he could feel the man's eyes on him, watching, analyzing, waiting for him to make a mistake. John was no fool. He had built his little empire of corruption over years, carefully insulating himself from anyone who might challenge his authority. And now, with Martin, disguised as Mike, asking too many questions, John's suspicions were clearly rising. The once subtle glances became longer, more scrutinizing. Any time Martin lingered in conversation with Carlo or other drivers, he could feel John's gaze burning into his back. It was obvious that John was starting to see Martin as a potential threat, someone who was digging too deep into the inner workings of the garage, the fines, the payments. Martin tried to play it cool, acting the part of the clueless rookie, but the tension was palpable. Despite the danger, Martin knew he couldn't stop now. He had gotten too close to the truth. The conversations with Carla had been eye-opening, and he had gathered enough evidence to know that John wasn't working alone. But every step closer to exposing the corruption made John more dangerous. Martin could sense the man's instincts sharpening, like a predator circling its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then one evening, after a particularly long shift, the moment came. The garage was nearly empty. Most of the drivers had already gone home, and the few that remained were preoccupied with paperwork or cleaning out their cabs. Martin was alone, wiping down the interior of his taxi, when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the quiet space. He turned just in time to see John stepping out from the shadows, his face partially hidden under the dim light of the garage's fluorescent bulbs. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something colder, more menacing. He moved closer, his posture relaxed, but there was a predatory edge to his movements. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately," John said, his voice low and controlled. There was no mistaking the threat beneath the calm tone. "That's not a good habit around here, rookie." Martin straightened, keeping his expression neutral, though his mind was already racing. He couldn't afford to show any signs of nervousness. "I'm just trying to understand how things work," Martin replied, his voice steady, meeting John's eyes without flinching. John chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. It was a dry, humorless laugh, more of a warning than an expression of amusement. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing as they bore into Martin. "You want some advice, Mike?" John's tone was sharp now, his lips twisting into a sneer. "Stop trying to understand things. People who poke around too much, they tend to find themselves in bad situations. Situations they can't get out of." There it was, the threat, laid out clearly. The thin veneer of friendliness had finally cracked, revealing the real John. He wasn't just a manager enforcing rules. He was a man who controlled his domain through fear and intimidation. And Martin, disguised as Mike, had gotten too close to upsetting that balance. Martin forced himself to remain calm, though his instincts were screaming at him to be careful. He could feel the weight of the conversation shifting, turning dangerous. He had to tread lightly. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said, keeping his voice even. "Just trying to do my job right. No harm in understanding what's expected of me. Is there?" John's eyes flashed with something dark. Frustration, maybe, or suspicion. Either way, it was clear he wasn't buying the act anymore. He leaned in slightly, his face inches from Martin's now. The stench of cigarettes and cheap cologne filled the space between them. "You think you're smart, don't you?" John hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I don't see what you're doing? Talking to Carla. Talking to the other drivers. You're trying to dig up dirt. Trying to stir things up. I don't care who you think you are, but I'm telling you, rookie, you don't want to go down that road." Martin's pulse quickened, but he didn't break eye contact. He couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. "I'm not trying to stir anything up," he said, his voice cool. "I'm just trying to understand what's fair." "Fair?" John's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes gleaming with something close to amusement. "There's no such thing as fair, not here. You think anyone up there cares about you or Carla or any of these other drivers? You're all just tools. You're here to keep the wheels turning, and if you break down, they'll replace you like that." He snapped his fingers for emphasis. "You think someone's going to swoop in and save you? No one's coming, Mike. The sooner you get that through your thick skull, the better off you'll be." Martin said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them, calculating his next move. He knew John was dangerous, but he also knew that John wouldn't make a move unless he felt absolutely cornered. For now, John was trying to scare him, to push him back into line. But Martin wasn't about to back down. He had seen enough, gathered enough evidence, to know that John wasn't just a corrupt manager. He was the linchpin of a much larger scheme, one that reached higher than the drivers knew. John took a step back, clearly expecting some kind of response, but Martin held his ground, keeping his expression unreadable. The two men stared at each other for a moment longer, the tension thick in the air, before John finally let out a soft grunt of frustration. "Consider this your last warning," John said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Keep your nose out of things that don't concern you, or you'll regret it. I guarantee that." Martin watched as John turned on his heel and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing through the empty garage. His threat lingered in the air, a dark promise of what could come if Martin pushed too far. But as Martin stood there, watching John's retreating figure, he felt a surge of determination. John had just confirmed what Martin already suspected. He was scared that his carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. The conversation had only fueled Martin's resolve. He had been careful up until now, playing the role of the rookie, but he knew he couldn't wait much longer. John was becoming more suspicious by the day, and if Martin didn't act soon, it would only be a matter of time before John tried something more drastic. The truth was there, just out of reach, and Martin was ready to take the next step to bring it all crashing down. He just needed the final piece, the undeniable proof that would not only expose John, but everyone who had allowed the corruption to fester within the company. As he walked out of the garage that night, Martin's mind was already racing with the next phase of his plan. He knew it would be risky, but there was no turning back now. John had shown his hand, and it was time for Martin to play his. The real fight was about to begin. The days following John's threat weighed heavily on Martin, but instead of backing down, he pushed forward with more determination. He knew that time was running out, and if he didn't act quickly, John's suspicion would turn into something far more dangerous. Martin had to gather enough evidence to not only expose John, but to bring down the entire corrupt structure that protected him. He wasn't just doing this for the company anymore. He was doing it for every driver who had been crushed under John's boot. Martin became methodical in his approach. Every interaction, every conversation became a potential lead. He recorded conversations on a small, discreet device hidden in his jacket pocket, capturing the disgruntled mutterings of drivers during breaks, the whispers about unpaid wages, the complaints about fines that seemed to appear out of nowhere. But it wasn't just about listening. Martin needed hard evidence, something undeniable. When John wasn't around, Martin would slip into the office or the garage late at night, carefully going through paperwork that John had carelessly left lying around. Each night, he took photographs of documents, fine receipts, altered driver logs, and financial reports that didn't match what the drivers were being told. Little by little, the pieces started to fall into place. It was a deliberate, organized scheme. John had been inflating fines, taking cuts from the money meant for company maintenance, and worst of all, selling data that was supposed to be confidential. One night, Martin found the smoking gun. It was an email printout buried under a pile of old invoices. The email was from an unknown source, discussing the transfer of client data. John had been selling personal information about the company's clients to third parties, people who could use that data for malicious purposes. Martin's heart sank as he realized the scope of the damage. This wasn't just about exploiting the drivers anymore. John had put thousands of innocent people at risk for his own gain. Despite the mounting pressure, Martin continued to play the role of Mike Thompson, the quiet driver, hiding his growing anger behind a mask of indifference. But inside, the fire burned hotter with each passing day. The corruption within the company ran deeper than he had ever imagined. John wasn't just a bully, he was a criminal, and his actions threatened the very foundation of the company Martin had built. Yet, it wasn't until a late-night conversation with Carla that everything became terrifyingly clear. They were sitting in her car after a long shift, the quiet of the night hanging between them. Carla was tired, worn down from the endless cycle of work and worry. But there was something different about her that night, a heaviness in her eyes that Martin hadn't seen before. She was fidgeting, her fingers tracing the edges of the steering wheel as if she was trying to gather the courage to speak. "Mike," she began, her voice low, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Martin shifted in his seat, sensing the gravity of what was coming. "What is it, Carla?" She sighed, glancing out the window for a moment before turning back to him, her voice barely a whisper. "John's been selling client data, personal information, addresses, credit card numbers. I've known about it for a while, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. He threatened me, Mike." Martin felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed from someone like Carla, a person he trusted, made it all too real. "What did he say?" Martin asked, his voice calm, though his mind was racing. Carla bit her lip, her hands tightening on the wheel. "He said if I told anyone, I'd lose my job, that I'd never work again. And you know how things are, Mike. I've got my kids to think about. I couldn't risk it. But now," her voice cracked slightly, and she blinked back tears. I don't know how much longer I can keep quiet." Martin took a deep breath, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He understood her fear. More than anyone, he understood the impossible position she was in. But this revelation, it changed everything. John wasn't just a corrupt manager pocketing extra money from fines. He was involved in something far more sinister, something that could destroy the lives of thousands of people. "It's not your fault, Carla," Martin said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did what you had to do to survive. But we can't let him get away with this. Not anymore." Carla turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "What are we supposed to do, Mike? If we go up against him, he'll ruin us. He's got connections up there. You know that. People protect him because he's feeding them, too." Martin's jaw clenched as he stared out into the darkness. She was right. This wasn't just about John. There were others in the company who were benefiting from his schemes. People who had turned a blind eye because it lined their pockets. But Martin couldn't allow this to continue. The company he had built was being corrupted from the inside out, and if he didn't act, it would collapse under the weight of its own greed. "I've been gathering evidence," Martin said quietly, turning to look at Carla. "Everything I can. I've got enough to bring him down, Carla. And not just him, the people protecting him, too." Carla's eyes widened in shock. "You've been... what? How?" "I've been recording conversations, taking pictures of documents. I've got enough proof to go to the authorities. But I need you to help me. Your testimony could be the final piece we need." Carla recoiled slightly, her face tightening with fear. "Mike, I can't put my kids through that. What if something happens to me? I've seen what John does to people who cross him." "I know," Martin said, his voice soft but firm. "But if we don't stop him, this won't ever end. He'll keep doing this, and more people will get hurt. You don't have to do this alone, Carla. I'll protect you." Carla stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for some sign of reassurance. Finally, she let out a long, shaky breath and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll do it. But you promise me, Mike. You promise me you'll keep me and my kids safe?" "I promise," Martin said, gripping her hand tightly. "I won't let anything happen to you." As they sat in the quiet darkness of the car, Martin knew that the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. John's threats no longer scared him. They only fueled his resolve. He had the evidence, and now he had Carla's testimony. It was only a matter of time before he brought everything to light. The company he had built was at risk, but this wasn't just about saving his business anymore. It was about saving the people who worked for him, the drivers who had been manipulated and exploited for too long. Martin couldn't wait any longer. It was time to take action. The truth was finally clear to Martin. John was not just a local tyrant skimming off fines and bullying drivers. He was deeply entangled in a network of corruption, something that extended far beyond the garage, threatening the very foundation of the company Martin had built. The risk was no longer just about money or reputation. Lives were at stake, and Martin knew that any wrong move could jeopardize not only his own safety, but also the lives of those around him, especially Carla, who had trusted him with her darkest fears. Martin knew he couldn't wait any longer. The evidence he had gathered was enough to expose John and those protecting him. But a confrontation was inevitable. He needed to face John head-on, to make him understand that his days of control and corruption were over. It was late, and the garage was nearly empty, the distant hum of the few remaining engines fading into silence. Martin, still disguised as Mike Thompson, waited in the shadows, his heart pounding with anticipation. He could hear John's boots echoing through the garage, heavy and deliberate, as he made his usual rounds, inspecting the taxis and going over paperwork with his usual air of self-importance. Martin knew this was his moment. "John!" Martin's voice cut through the silence, firm and steady. His heart was racing, but his words were calm, measured. John stopped mid-step and turned slowly, his face partially illuminated by the weak fluorescent light overhead. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Martin standing across the garage. The cigarette that hung lazily from his lips bobbed slightly as he spoke. "You again?" John's voice dripped with disdain. "What do you want, rookie?" Martin stepped forward, his gaze locked on John. He was no longer playing the role of a meek driver. His presence was commanding now, and there was no mistaking the shift in the air. "I know what you've been doing," Martin said, his voice cold but clear. "The fines, the money you've stolen, the data you've sold. I've got everything, documents, recordings. It's all right here." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folder filled with evidence he had painstakingly gathered over the past weeks. John's expression flickered, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. "You think you've got something on me?" he sneered, taking a drag from his cigarette. "You're just another driver. You can't even begin to understand how things work around here." Martin didn't flinch. "I understand more than you think," he said evenly, "and I know enough to bring you down. Everything you've done, John, every dollar you've stolen, every life you've ruined, it's all about to come crashing down." For a brief moment, John's face was unreadable, his eyes flicking from Martin to the folder in his hand. Then, suddenly, he burst out laughing. It was a cold, hollow sound, filled with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. "You think you can take me down?" John mocked, shaking his head as if the idea was absurd. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with. I've got friends in high places, Mike. Real power. You think some rookie driver and a folder of papers are going to change anything?" Martin felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he kept his composure. "You think no one cares, don't you?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. "You think you can hide behind your so-called friends, but you're wrong. I care, and this stops now." With a deliberate movement, Martin removed the worn baseball cap from his head and slowly shrugged off the old jacket he had been wearing for weeks as part of his disguise. He stood tall, letting the weight of the moment sink in. John's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the man standing in front of him, Not a lowly driver, but the very man who owned the company he had been stealing from. "My name is Martin Walker," he said, his voice strong and unyielding. "I built this company, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else destroy it." The cigarette fell from John's lips, hitting the concrete floor with a soft hiss. His face went pale as the realization of what was happening hit him like a tidal wave. This has to be a joke," John stammered, his bravado faltering. You can't be." "I am." Martin cut him off, his eyes locked on John's now panicked face. "And I've seen everything. I've heard everything. You've taken advantage of the drivers, you've stolen from them, and you've put innocent people at risk by selling their personal information. I have the evidence to prove it all, and it's already in the hands of people who will make sure you pay for what you've done." John stumbled backward, his confidence unraveling before Martin's eyes. He tripped over a toolbox, barely catching himself before he hit the ground. You don't understand," he gasped, the panic creeping into his voice. "I know people, powerful people. They won't let this happen. You'll be ruined before you can even." "You're finished, John," Martin said, his voice like steel. "There's nothing left to protect you." Before John could respond, two figures appeared at the far end of the garage. They moved quickly and quietly, their footsteps barely audible on the concrete floor. John's eyes darted toward them, and a look of pure terror crossed his face as he realized who they were. "John Reed," one of the officers called out, his voice firm. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and cybercrimes." John froze as the officers approached him, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Wait, no! This can't be happening," he shouted, his voice cracking as the officers grabbed his arms and began to restrain him. He struggled weakly, but it was clear that the fight had gone out of him. "I'm untouchable," John screamed, his voice echoing through the garage as they led him away. "They'll destroy you, Walker. You don't know what you've started." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The officers dragged him out of the garage, his voice growing fainter with each step. Martin stood there, watching in silence as the man who had terrorized so many was finally taken down. For a long moment he didn't move, the weight of everything that had happened settling over him like a heavy cloak. The anger and frustration he had carried for weeks began to dissolve, replaced by a deep sense of responsibility. He had done what he had set out to do, but this was just the beginning. There were others who had enabled John, people who had turned a blind eye to his corruption because it served their interests. Martin knew the fight wasn't over. Cleaning up the mess John had left behind would take time, and there were still battles to be fought. But for now, the first and most important step had been taken. As the garage fell silent once more, Martin felt a sense of resolve harden within him. His company had nearly been destroyed by greed and corruption, but he wasn't going to let it fall. He would rebuild it, brick by brick, and ensure that it became the company he had always envisioned, a company built on integrity, not lies. With one last glance at the empty garage, Martin turned and walked out, ready to face whatever came next. In the days following John's arrest, Martin Walker stepped back into his role as CEO with a newfound sense of purpose. The revelation of his undercover operation sent shockwaves through the company's upper echelons. The executives, many of whom had grown too comfortable with their unchecked power, were visibly shaken. Whispers spread like wildfire throughout the halls of the company's headquarters. Some were confused, while others were afraid, knowing full well that their complicity in the corruption was about to catch up with them. Martin wasted no time. Emergency meetings were called, and each one was as tense as the last. As he walked into the first meeting, Martin could feel the weight of the eyes on him. Executives, managers, and board members, all sitting in nervous silence, waiting to see how the fallout from John's downfall would affect them. But Martin didn't care about their discomfort. This was not the time for pleasantries or half-measures. The rot within the company needed to be cut out, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to make that happen. When he stood before them, the room fell silent. Martin surveyed the faces of the people who had once looked up to him as their leader, their expressions now filled with uncertainty. Many of them had known about John's corruption, or at least turned a blind eye to it. The sense of complacency that had allowed someone like John to operate unchecked was palpable in the air. Martin knew what he had to do. "We're starting over," Martin said, his voice firm, cutting through the tension in the room. He glanced around, making sure to meet the eyes of each executive. This company is no longer going to be a breeding ground for greed and corruption. I've seen firsthand the damage that's been done. I lived it, and I will not allow what we've built to be destroyed by the selfishness of a few. There were murmurs of discomfort, some executives shifting in their seats, but no one dared to interrupt him. For too long, many of you have ignored what was happening right under your noses. Some of you were complicit, and some of you simply didn't care. That ends now, Martin continued, his tone brooking no argument. We're implementing a new era of transparency. Everyone in this room who played a part in the corruption, or who enabled it by turning a blind eye, will be held accountable. The room fell into a stunned silence. The gravity of his words settled heavily on everyone in attendance. A few faces went pale as they realized what was coming next. Martin's eyes narrowed as he zeroed in on a handful of individuals, the ones he knew had been John's closest allies in the upper ranks. They had profited off his schemes, whether through direct participation or simply staying silent in exchange for protection. "You know who you are," Martin said, his voice cold, "and you will no longer have a place here." Without further explanation, Martin motioned to his legal team, who had been waiting at the back of the room. They stepped forward, handing over termination papers to several key executives. There were no arguments, no protests, just a stunned realization that their time at the company had come to an abrupt end. Martin didn't stop there. Over the next few days, he met with department heads, managers, and even the lower-level supervisors who had turned a blind eye to John's abuses. One by one, those who had allowed the corruption to spread were removed from their positions. The company was being purged from the inside out. Among those watching the changes unfold was Carla. She had been instrumental in exposing John's actions, and Martin had taken note of her courage. She stood out in a sea of fear and complacency, someone who had risked everything to stand up for what was right. After the meeting, Martin sought her out. "You did something most people would never have the courage to do," Martin said, pulling her aside in the hallway. His tone was sincere, but there was also a weight behind his words, an understanding that Carla had taken a great personal risk by speaking out. Carla looked up at him, still processing the enormity of what had transpired. She had never imagined the quiet, unassuming Mike Thompson could have been Martin Walker all along. "I never expected this," she admitted, shaking her head in disbelief. "I never thought you were who you are. You seemed so normal, like one of us." Martin smiled, though there was no humor in it, just a sense of understanding. "That's what I needed to be," he said, his voice calm. "I had to see for myself what was happening, and you were the only one who had the guts to speak up when everyone else stayed quiet. That's why I need your help, Carla. I need people like you to make sure this never happens again." Carla blinked in surprise, her eyes widening slightly as the weight of his words sank in. "Me? What do you mean?" "I'm promoting you," Martin said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I need people in leadership positions who understand what it's like on the ground, people who will stand up for the drivers, for the staff, people who won't let this company fall back into the wrong hands. Carla's initial shock gave way to a mix of pride and gratitude. She had spent years struggling, fighting just to survive, and now, in a twist of fate, she was being offered a position of real influence. Her eyes shone with a sense of renewed purpose. "I'll do everything I can," she promised, her voice steady. "I won't let this happen again." Martin nodded, satisfied. "I know you won't." With Carla by his side and a new leadership team being carefully selected, Martin began the long process of rebuilding the company from the ground up. Every policy was reviewed, every practice scrutinized. The drivers, who had been ignored for too long, were given a voice. Wages were restructured, work hours were made fair, and the oppressive system of fines that had kept so many in debt was abolished. For the first time in years, the company began to feel like a place of hope rather than despair. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, resistance from those who had thrived under the old system. But Martin was relentless. He knew that this transformation wasn't just about the business. It was about restoring the trust of the people who worked for him. It was about making sure that his company stood for something more than just profit. Over the months that followed, the changes took root. The toxic culture that had once permeated every level of the organization was slowly replaced with one of fairness and respect. Drivers who had once felt powerless now had a say in how things were run. The shift was palpable, and while the wounds from John's reign of terror were still fresh, there was a sense of optimism in the air. And at the center of it all was Martin, working alongside his team, ensuring that every decision made was aligned with the new values he had set for the company. It was hard work, but it was the kind of work that gave him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, after another long meeting with the board, Carla caught up with him in the hallway. "You did it," she said, smiling softly. "You actually did it. You turned this place around." Martin paused, considering her words. "We did it," he corrected, his expression thoughtful. "But it's not over. There's still a lot more to fix." Carla nodded, understanding the depth of his responsibility. "And we will." Together, as they stood there, side by side, Martin knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still more work to be done. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like the company was heading in the right direction, back toward the vision he had once had when he first started building it. And this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Months passed, and the company that had once been stained by corruption was now becoming a beacon of ethics and integrity. The change wasn't immediate, nor was it easy, but Martin could see the transformation everywhere. On the faces of the drivers, in the way the employees interacted with one another, and in the day-to-day operations that had once felt cold and transactional, but now reflected a sense of purpose. The oppressive atmosphere that had once suffocated the workers was replaced by one of fairness and transparency. Martin knew that his undercover journey as Mike Thompson had not only reshaped the company, it had reshaped him as well. Sitting in his old office, Martin found himself lost in thought. The large windows behind him offered a view of the bustling city, but the impressive skyline no longer held the same significance it once did. For years, his success had been measured by the size of his empire, the deals he closed, and the fortune he amassed. But now, none of that seemed to matter in the way it used to. His mind kept drifting back to those long hours in the taxi, driving through the streets, listening to the quiet suffering of his employees. He had been blind to their struggles for too long. But now, he understood that his greatest achievement wasn't the wealth or the power he'd accumulated. It was the trust he had earned back from the people who had kept his company alive. The knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Carla stepped in with a soft smile, her face radiating the calm confidence she had gained since taking on her new leadership role. "There's someone here who wants to see you," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement, as if she was holding back the punchline of a joke. Martin raised an eyebrow, curious. "Who is it?" Carla's smile widened, but she didn't answer directly. "You'll see," she said, gesturing toward the door. Intrigued, Martin gave a small nod of approval, signaling for her to let the visitor in. As Carla stepped aside, a young man appeared in the doorway. Martin recognized him instantly, one of the taxi drivers he had crossed paths with during his time as Mike Thompson. The young man stood awkwardly for a moment, clearly nervous, his eyes darting around the room as if unsure whether he was supposed to be there. "Come in," Martin said kindly, standing up from his desk. "What can I do for you?" The young driver hesitated, swallowing hard before taking a few tentative steps forward. He was clutching his hat in his hands, twisting it nervously as he spoke. "Mr. Walker," he began, his voice shaky at first. I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. You didn't have to do any of it, but you did." Martin could see the genuine gratitude in the man's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in so many drivers since the company had turned a corner. For most of them, Martin had been just a distant name, the figure at the top of the corporate ladder. But now they knew he had walked in their shoes, that he had seen the world from their perspective. "I just wanted to say," the young driver continued, fumbling slightly as he tried to find the right words, "it means a lot that someone like you, someone at the top, actually cared enough to make a difference. You didn't have to, but you did." Martin's throat tightened slightly as he listened. He extended his hand, offering a firm handshake to the driver. "We all have to care," Martin said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet conviction. "That's how real change happens. It doesn't come from the top or the bottom. It comes from people working together, caring about one another." The young man nodded, visibly relieved as the tension melted from his posture. "Well," he said, glancing down at his hat before looking back up at Martin, "you've made a real difference. For all of us." With that, the driver gave a small nod of thanks and turned to leave the office, his steps lighter than when he had entered. Carla, who had been standing quietly by the door, watched him go with a knowing smile. When the door finally clicked shut behind him, she turned to Martin. "You've got them all talking, you know," she said. "The drivers, the staff. Everyone feels it. The company's different now." Martin leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms as he considered her words. "It had to change," he said quietly. "We couldn't keep going the way we were. I let things slip for too long. But now, I think we're finally heading in the right direction." Carla took a few steps into the room, her expression thoughtful. "I've been here a long time, Martin, and I've seen this place at its worst. But I've never seen it like this. People actually believe in the company now. They believe in you." Martin's gaze drifted toward the large windows behind his desk, the city skyline framed against the backdrop of his office. For so many years, he had seen that view as a symbol of his success, of everything he had built. But now it felt different. The skyscrapers, the lights, the hustle and bustle of the world outside. It was all part of the bigger picture, but it wasn't the picture itself. "I didn't set out to change the world," Martin said after a moment, his voice quiet but sincere. "I just wanted to build something I could be proud of. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. It wasn't about the money or the expansion or the profits. It was about the people. It was always about the people." Carla smiled softly, understanding the weight of his words. "And now you've found that again." Martin nodded, his mind reflecting on all that had happened. The sleepless nights, the hard decisions, the risk he had taken to expose John's corruption. It had all been worth it. He had rediscovered the purpose that had driven him to start the company in the first place, creating something that valued every person involved. "We've still got a lot of work to do," Martin said, pushing off from his desk. "But I know we can get there." Carla stepped closer, her tone light but encouraging. "We will. And with you leading us, I'm pretty sure we'll do more than just get there. We'll thrive." Martin chuckled softly, but there was a warmth in his chest, a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, Carla," he said, his voice sincere. "For everything." She smiled, her eyes shining with the same gratitude she had shown him from the moment he had revealed the truth about himself. "I'm just glad you were the one to make it right." As Carla left the office, Martin returned to his desk and sank into his chair. For a moment, he sat in silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. His time as Mike Thompson had changed him, not just as a CEO, but as a person. It had reminded him of the value of humility, of seeing the world through the eyes of those who kept his company running every day. Martin glanced out the window once more, the city stretching out before him. But this time, it wasn't the height of the towers or the glint of the glass buildings that caught his attention. It was the people, the workers, the drivers, the countless lives that intersected with his company. They were the real legacy, not the buildings, not the wealth, but the people whose lives he had touched and the trust he had earned. With a deep breath, Martin turned back to his desk. There was still work to be done, still challenges to overcome, but for the first time in a long time he felt light, free from the weight of ambition that had once clouded his vision. Now, he could see clearly, and as he picked up his pen to continue working, Martin knew one thing with certainty. His legacy would be measured not by what he built, but by how he treated the people who built it with him. If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.